Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Shine Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Shine Hills at shinehills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
Across the street and around the world, Shine Hills.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. And as promised, Nathan, let's dive into Ukraine.
Yes.
Now, this is going to be aired, 2 weeks away. So
Right.
there's going to be a lot of things that have happened in 2 weeks' time. And so, but right now, there's some observations that it's just some things that I just want to process out loud.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
And so I'm what they call a verbal processor. You, I think, are more of a thinker. In other words, you think it all through before it comes out of your mouth.
No, sir.
And it
Not
comes
always.
out really, really well. I kind of like verbally process it. It's like, okay, I've heard this, and what do you think of this? And I'm not saying I'm landing anywhere, but I'm just like, what do you think? So
Right.
this is kind of how I'm going to approach this a little
Right.
bit. Okay?
Sounds good.
But one of the things I've been certainly, my heart's been mashed by the images.
Right.
There's no question about the devastation. And then, but I have a caveat question within that,
Mhm.
because I keep hearing these things like, well, that's actually possible fake news or possible, how do you discern that? I don't necessarily want to solve that one, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that
Yeah.
one. But we do know that there are 2.3 million Ukrainians that have crossed the border into Poland, right?
Right.
It's like a big number, something like that.
Huge.
They said it's same size as Warsaw.
That's
It's
unbelievable.
it really is.
Wow.
But the outpouring of the Polish people to take people not just into camps,
Mhm.
they're taking these people into their homes,
Right.
and they're coming to those train stations. They're dropping off food. They're dropping off toys for the kids. They're doing everything they can to comfort and to give hospitality. I mean,
Right.
what I would consider to be true Christian hospitality
Mhm.
to a stranger.
Right.
And that blows me away. And I'm going to finish my verbal processing. I can't help but believe, because I know of a lot of missionaries
Mhm.
that have served in Ukraine, and I've heard some stories from people. It's like, now these people are the real deal. These
Mhm.
people know the Lord. It's
Right.
not just you can tell. Their scriptures they're quoting, the asks they're making, some of those things. Like, these are true Christian asks of brothers and sisters in Christ, and
Right.
it's just it's amazing. So I know that the evangelical voice is. I don't know how big it is in Ukraine, but I know it's big.
Mhm.
I also know that the Polish people are actually being more Christian than I think anything that I've seen in my lifetime,
Right.
just by offering the hospitality.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts of any of the above?
Oh, yes, sir. I do. And actually, I want to come back to Poland in a minute, but also just to point out that in Romania and in the country of Moldova, we're watching similar responses.
Is that right? They're
And
taking
so-
people in.
Right, they
Yeah.
are massively.
Wow.
And so, but coming back to Poland, what I do find very interesting is that you go back far enough, and Pope John Paul II started off as a
Right.
young priest in Poland
In Poland.
and lived out his faith in a very public format. And obviously, there are theological differences between where his faith was and in the Catholic Church and where you and I might be.
Yeah.
But by the same token, when you see someone respond out of a desire to live out their faith,
Yeah.
I respect that very greatly. And
Yeah,
we're watching in
agree.
Poland, close to the fall of the Iron Curtain, Pope John Paul II actually went back to Poland, and the response was amazing. So
Hmm.
already there was a Christian underground that was responding very strongly.
I think I remember
And
that.
yes, sir,
Yeah.
it began to grow and grow and grow and grow. And what we're finding also is that the evangelical church has had a huge influence there.
Really.
And so
Yeah.
even though
Does
there
not
was
surprise me.
right, there was a lot of repression under the Soviets, there was a lot of Christian response that continued underground.
Yeah.
And now we're watching it live and in real time as other people who are being oppressed by the Russians are trying to find someone who will help them out, and Poland is right there.
Isn't that amazing?
So proud of them.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, they're playing a geopolitical role that's pretty bold, I think. They're playing a humanitarian role
Right.
that is bold and heartwarming, and I don't know, kind of jaw-dropping for me. Just to watch this, it's like,
Right.
wow, I've never seen this kind of here, come into our homes. We're going to take care
Right.
of you, and for as long as you need to be here, is the stories I keep hearing, and
Right.
it's really endearing to see what's happening. And so I just can't help but believe that there's people around those tables, and there's people praying, and Christ is a part of that conversation. And it makes you just wonder through. I mean, unfortunately, why is it? I don't know why, but tragedy also. You hear the political thing. Don't waste a crisis or something like that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, God uses crisis also. He allows certainly these crises, no question. And but sometimes some of the greatest fruit and spiritual, I don't know, revivals, if you will, happen in times like this. And I think we're seeing something big.
Well, the world sometimes it receives a shock that forces us to come back to a position of reality. In the late 1990s, there was a Thomas Friedman who writes for the New York Times and is considered a fairly moderate to leftist kind of economist. But he wrote about the then fact that there was no country that had a McDonald's that had ever attacked another country that had a McDonald's.
Oh,
So actually, this is the first war in world history where Russia, with a lot of McDonald's, have attacked Ukraine with a lot of McDonald's.
Yeah.
But here's the
right.
interesting
Oh my
thing.
gosh.
The theory of the leftist, a kind of godless theory, is that we could one day work ourselves to a position of peace.
Oh.
And every time we come to a new position of peace, it's a little bit like Immanuel Kant's idea that with the Enlightenment growing, eventually we would do away with war. And then we find out, no, all the Enlightenment did is gave us greater weapons to fight one another with.
Oh, wow.
And so now with this interconnected world, and up until just recently, no economy who had ever had a McDonald's attacked another economy with a McDonald's. Even that delusion of peace is now gone. And one thing that we always find at the baseline of the human experience is that there is something called the total depravity of
Yes,
man.
absolutely.
And so, and that's really,
And
again,
I don't think
picture.
people that I don't think, let's just take the liberal. They don't understand evil. That's what I've
Right.
always thought. And
That's
they just
right.
they just think you can negotiate with evil. And the evil one obviously is behind evil, right? But evil's going to have its way. The only way to deal with evil, you can't negotiate with it.
That's
one.
right.
That's one
That's
thing
right.
I'm going to say. I also want to say that going through this whole thing of what God's doing and all these wonderful things. I mean, that does not negate the tragedy of the loss of life, and then and some of that is just. And so I can hear that person out there that's saying, so you think that this all justifies? Well, no. I mean, it's horrible loss of life.
Right.
I'm just saying and so this kind of goes to that question. So if God is all powerful and if he's all benevolent and he's good, then why would a good God allow, war? That's the big question.
Right.
And the actual answer to that is, without good gives us, there has to be evil so for there to be good. And the good, I believe, or evil is the absence of good when good is completely gone. But God, because he gave us free will, that's a risky thing he gave humans. But he didn't want us to be robots. And so this possibility of evil is there, and evil rises up against evil. And I think we deal with it in probably some I don't think people really understand it, and therefore they don't know how to deal with it. But I'm not saying that God's saying, okay, this justifies all the death and carnage.
Exactly.
It's just the fact that that's what happens, and God can make good come out of a really bad situation. Romans 8:28, and I think we may be seeing that.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you saw some of those things.
I do. And also it goes back to your first point. When you look at how the Polish people have responded and how Christians in general respond, some people sit back and wonder, why is there evil in the world?
Yeah.
The Christian's first response is recognizing that there is evil in the world,
Yep.
and that we have a responsibility, first of all, to help those who are caught up in that struggle. And secondly, recognize that evil is present in all of us.
Mm.
And it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Russian man who had been persecuted by the USSR and was able to flee to the East, who said that the line of good and evil runs not through nations and in states. It runs right through the middle of every human heart.
Exactly right.
And so when we look at the fact of evil, the Christian actually has the format, the understanding to know how to respond to it. And so we don't, like you just said, we don't parlay with evil.
No.
We don't try to just allow it to slip by. We recognize that there is evil in the world and it must be responded to.
Right.
And so in a Western culture that denies that there is evil, that tries to say that there's multiple truths, and that different people live out different truths, when you look at a man whose truth is that he has to attack his neighbor, you recognize this whole kind of woke absence of truth, relativism,
Yeah.
it doesn't really work.
Yeah, it's true.
And so we have to respond based upon reality.
That's exactly right. I want to Frank Turek. You know that name, I think, probably. You know Frank Turek?
I've heard the name.
Let me read what he says about
Okay.
evil. Okay, so it says this: so evil can't exist unless good exists,
Mhm.
but good can't exist unless God exists. In other words, there can be no objective evil unless there's objective good. And there can be no objective good unless God exists. If evil is real, and we all know it is, then God exists.
It's true.
Isn't that a cool progression of how he kind of works through this thing? And so, but contrast that with the 1960s motive of if God is all powerful and if God is all knowing and God is perfectly good, evil exists.
Mhm.
Therefore, here's your conclusion.
Right.
God is not powerful or good, or one of those is in question because
Right.
we know there's evil. And he says, no, that the fact that there's evil evil couldn't exist unless there was good exists. I just think that's so profound and understanding of those
Mhm.
two. And if there's good, there's God. And so actually this whole motif of argument, if you want to call it that, really is what, I went through a really questioning time in my life. And when I knew that there was evil, and I just couldn't believe that man could be that evil on his own.
Mhm.
And since evil, I know where evil came from. That's from Satan himself. And if there's evil, then I know there's good, and then I know there's God.
It's powerful.
It kind of got me through a really questioning time in my life,
Right.
in my probably mid to early 20s, and but it's the presence of evil. It's like man can't be that evil on his own. He's got to
Right,
have some
yeah.
help. So we're seeing a lot of these things on display right now. Now, there's another thing that I think I'm just verbally processing. It kind of falls into the same kind of camp that's happening. And I think we saw this in World War II. God allowed World War II, whatever, but God used World War II to, when they restructured all the countries. Actually, that happened. A lot of that happened after World War I. But then when they gave the Jewish people a land back in Israel, where they are today,
Mhm.
and they became a state in 1948, I believe, after the war, that was all as a result of World War II. And so you can say, wow, God used some really tragic things, but he got their people back in the land, which he said he would do in
Yeah.
Ezekiel 36 and 37.
Exactly.
And that happened. That's
Right.
a prophecy. Well, so that's been happening. Now I think they could say like there's 7, maybe 8 million Jews in Israel today, and there's still people coming in. Well, one of the things the guy that I listened to, Amir Sarfati, he's a Messianic Jew. He posts a lot. I like to look at his perspective on things, but he said that there are planes full of Russian Jews coming out of Russia, as there are planes full of Ukrainian Jews coming out of Ukraine, flying into Ben Gurion Airport and deplaning and starting a new life. There you go. Help Jewish refugees. That's awesome.
This is crazy. So if you're just listening, we're sitting in a studio here talking. The last email I just received was from a group called Friends of Israel.
There you go.
And it's talking about millions of Ukrainian Jews fleeing to Israel right now.
Yeah.
And so you look at the tragedy. By the way, we don't overturn the fact that this is tragedy.
Oh man, yeah.
And yet God can use even the bad things
Yeah.
in the world to move toward a state toward a state of righteousness, toward a state that is good.
Yeah.
And so it is, and it doesn't negate the fact that these are tragedies.
Yeah.
But
true.
God uses all things to work together for his good.
That's right.
To them who love God, to them who are called according to his purposes.
Well, and I would say too, he's used, I don't know, it takes sometimes a tragedy to drive. I know it was tragedy in my own life
Mhm.
that drove me to my knees, and I started hearing that small voice in my heart to say, go a different path in your life. I mean,
Right.
that was all based on what drove me to my knees was not my goodness. It was my difficult circumstances,
Right, right,
and God used all that.
right.
And I look back on it now and you think, wow, lost all this and this and this, but it's like, man, no, God used every bit of that. And,
Right.
and I'm thrilled.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm thrilled that God used those circumstances. I'm not thrilled for the circumstances. They're hard.
Right.
They were hard.
God's
And-
done this throughout both the history of the Jewish people,
Yeah.
to either bring them back to himself. For instance, the Babylonian invasion of the southern kingdom of Israel, and then eventually calling them back to a place of righteousness under Nehemiah. Or you even take the early church in the book of Acts, where they were basically banded together very tightly in Jerusalem, and God allowed the persecution to create essentially a Christian diaspora where they flooded all throughout the Roman Empire. So it doesn't negate the fact that those are evil things that happen, but God still allows those things to work together for a greater good.
Yep, exactly. Well, I think that's being on display in our time right now, and there's certainly tragedy and certainly loss and certainly things we can be praying for, and for the people that are caught up in this. But at the same time, I rejoice in the rejoice with those who rejoice, and
Mhm.
weep with those who weep, and there's a lot of those on both sides of that
Mhm.
spectrum. Okay, now I want to ask you a question. So this is random, so
Yes, sir.
brace yourself. But it kind of falls into the category of, remember when Jesus said in Matthew 24, watch out. Okay, the disciples come to him and say, okay, when's all this going to take place?
Mhm.
Tell us about the end times, right?
Right.
And I just think it's an interesting thing. The first thing that Jesus says, and we've talked about it here a lot, watch out that no one deceives you,
Right.
and that there will be deceives and deceive even the elect, if that were possible. They're like, we could all be deceived.
Right.
The elect can be deceived. So that's like, we've got to be really careful about the information that's coming in. And I've tried to do that. And so let's just take Russia. We've always heard, the Russian propaganda. Everybody,
Right.
every country's got propaganda. I get that. But right now with the communications cut off, and I really don't know what their people are hearing. I don't know what the people know. Some of the stories you hear they don't have a lot of really good information. In fact, I heard some podcasts and saying things that the mothers of those Russian soldiers, they thought they were on just this exercise, and then had no idea that they were
Right.
on this mission to overthrow Ukraine.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if any of it's true, but
Right.
I'm just saying. Talk to me about. Can you speak to a little bit of the information or the disinformation, and how do you sort through all that stuff?
That's a very good question. And actually, it's one of the most important ones I think that we have to face as Christians today.
Yeah, I think so.
And the Bible actually encourages us repeatedly. So you look at Russia right now, and I saw some statistics not too long ago, and I'm sure they're moving all the time. But the vast majority of people in Russia think that Putin is doing the right thing, and they're blaming the invasion of another country supposedly on that other country.
Okay.
Or they're blaming it on the U.S. or on NATO.
Yeah.
And so what's happened is their media has begun to control the minds of the people. And we've seen that for 2 years. You'll find that some people early on said, the coronavirus did not originate in a lab in China. And they were kicked off of social media and everything else. And
Yeah.
eventually the United States said, oh, no, it happened in a lab in China. And all of a sudden, those people who had been kicked off, or no one ever says anything about it anymore.
Yeah. Right.
It is possible to
It's true.
manipulate people via news.
Yeah.
So then what does the Christian do?
Yes.
And so when
Good
we
question.
look at that position, Jesus warned, and we find it in the book of Luke, chapter 12, and he was talking about how there would come a day where mother would be divided against daughter, and daughter
Yeah.
against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and so on.
Yeah.
And he writes this starting in verse 54, and he said to the multitudes, "Whenever you see a cloud rising out of the west, immediately say to yourself, a shower is coming, and so it is. And when you see the south wind blow, you say, there will be hot weather, and there is. Hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky and of the earth. How is it you cannot discern the times?"
Wow.
And what he's saying is that we need to be discerners of the time we live in.
Yeah, for sure.
And what we find oftentimes is that people will wind up believing whatever is put in front of them.
Yeah.
And we don't actually look at it wisely. Paul wrote this in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5. He says, starting in verse 14, "Therefore he says, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." And so when we talk about seeing circumspectly, it's a rarely used word in English, but it has a great root, if you will, in previous language. What it means, literally, as you talk about circumspect, circum we know means to go around, like circumnavigate, to go around the globe.
Okay.
Spect is the same root for like spectacles.
Okay.
You and I both are wearing we now call them glasses, but
Yeah,
the
right.
technical term is spectacles.
Okay.
To be able to see all around us, to be able to see things. And that's what the Christian and the Holy Spirit, a person that is in God's word, is able to do. They're able to see circumspectly.
Right.
And so you look at events like Russia and Ukraine, or the Polish people, or even over the last couple of years regarding COVID-19 and different things.
Yeah.
We see differently.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to look as wise and not as fools to
Right.
see circumspectly.
But in some of the things that helped us see, I mean, early on, I think the very first sermon I preached during COVID was, God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a
That's
spirit
right.
of power and love and sound mind. So it's like, I remember saying, there's not a verse anywhere in Scripture that says, okay, now is the time to freak out.
That's right. That's right.
We don't.
Right.
We don't have that verse.
Right.
So we're supposed to live, if that He's not given us a spirit of timidity, and if we have that spirit of fear, the spirit of fear is what it is. We live in that spirit of fear. Then God didn't put that there. Somebody
That's
else
right.
did. That came from someplace else. And so, but we have been driven with fear, and and then I can say that, and then hear a report. And it's like, oh wow, I had to it was a gut check that whole time, because you read something online, and it's like, wow, this seems like it's overblown. And then you read something else, like, well, I got to be careful. And I think we just went back and forth in this whole thing and tried to say, okay, what is you really do have to look a little bit further down the road and say, okay, God, I'm gonna trust you in this, or whatever. I mean, I think it gives a Christian ability not to be thrown and tossed by the winds.
That's right.
Because that's I think there's still a lot of that is trying to be used. It's kind of interesting how that's faded now. Everything is all Russia and Ukraine. We won't even talk about masks now. Ever since the Super Bowl,
so true.
right? Super Bowl's over.
I haven't thought about it till just now, but that's a good point.
Yeah. Except for if you're flying. If you fly, you're still wearing a mask. But anyway, I think you're right, though. I think the Spirit of God doesn't mean everything a preacher says is right. I mean, you can't listen to every preacher and says, or myself included. It's like I'm trying to process, pray through, find good sources, and work through these, and bounce them off wise people as well. And it's like, okay, what do you see here? And but it's not easy, for sure. But I think this whole idea of guarding ourselves against the false narratives, that's a big challenge.
Right. Well, I've seen several different reactions, even within the Christian community, as there are rising wars and rumors of wars that we hear about. I've seen people respond in different ways. Oh my goodness, the end is coming, so basically I'm going to stop all activity.
Oh man, that's
bad.
right. That's wrong too. Exactly.
I've seen another activity take place where, the end is near, I'm going to go buy beans and bullets.
Okay,
and I'm going to stock up because they don't believe in the imminent return of Christ.
Right.
And so you see different kind of, every one of them though is fear-based. these different reactions.
Yeah.
So the Christian, what we ought to do is always walk wisely, make sure our family's taken care of to the best of our ability, all these different things, but we don't stop serving God until he calls us home.
That's right.
And so in every one of these, we just continue to
It's a
walk
good reminder.
circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise.
I really like that. I'm going to add one more thing because I don't think I said this last time, and if I did, I apologize to you all. But I'm fascinated with this Messianic Jewish lens that I get to look through Amir's eyes, and he said something about Ukraine that it's like I don't think anybody had seen except a Jewish lens would see this.
Oh, fascinating.
But he said if you remember in Ezekiel 38, nobody comes to the aid of Israel except God.
Okay.
You remember the hailstones and there's an earthquake and there's a, that whole, it says fire and brimstone, so probably volcanic eruptions and some natural disasters pound Gog and Magog in the Ezekiel 38 war. That everybody, we've talked about that quite a bit. And but he said, what's nobody could really fathom is that how is it that all of Israel's allies, no one's going to come to their aid. The United States is not going to come to their aid. The UK is not going to come to their aid. Nobody's going to come to their aid. Why is that? How's that even possible? And Amir said, you look at Ukraine, nobody is coming, they're afraid of who? Russia. Right. And who's Gog and Magog? That's Russia. I mean, Magog is the conglomerates with them, according to Scripture. It's Rosh and Meshach and Tubal and all those Gomer and all those countries. That's and Iran and all those countries that it prophesies that will come against Turkey, against Israel in the last day, and nobody's going to come to their aid. And he said one of the things we're getting to see in living color is nobody's coming, and why that we don't come to their aid. We're afraid of World War III, right? And where no one's willing to, really, come, the NATO forces to come to the aid of Ukraine. He said, this is basically what we'll see at, isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
But you don't look at that lens unless, and I'm not saying, Poland is certainly, they're trying to do some things.
Right.
Who knows, maybe somebody else, but it's still, he's just using it as a metaphor to say, this is kind of a foreshadowing of something that we know is going to happen with Israel.
Which is so intriguing. So here's one little factum that's always been pretty interesting to me. You ever heard of the Pale of Settlement? So beyond the pale.
Yeah.
You ever heard beyond the pale? So the Pale of Settlement was a region in Russia that incorporates much of modern day Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Romania and other places. And essentially it was a place where they've pushed all of their Jewish people into one area.
Oh, wow.
And then they would execute great, horrible pogroms against them and just annihilate different people. But there's a lot of Jewish people there in this area and have been for a couple hundred years.
I don't think I realized that until just recently.
Yeah. So when you look at why some of this activity really is interesting from a Christian perspective, understanding the Bible, I don't know how it all plays out, but there's a lot of things at play.
But I think we look at it as like, okay, it's the globalists, it's the nationalists of Russia that are pushing back NATO and all those. We hear all those arguments, and it's like, yeah, but God's using all of this pressure,
right?
And He's pulling His Jewish people back home, just like He said He would prophesy to.
That's right.
I think it's fascinating. So, well, hopefully that gave people enough to chew on.
Right. There's a lot there.
We, like I say, we're broadcasting this 2 weeks before this will be aired, so who knows what's going to happen by then. But thank you for tuning in, and thanks for just kind of wrestling with some of these issues. These are important issues, and I would say to all of us, God did not give us a spirit of fear. We are to be strong and very courageous. God bless you all.